Hello, Grieve Chelwa is my name, and welcome to the Mobilize podcast. We are back to square one. We're back again, unfortunately, to where we were in 2000. Debts are seen as unjust. Debts are seen as immoral. What is the point of gaining independence when you have no control over your natural resources? It's a very bizarre and useless type of argument. $50 billion per annum, every year, disappears from Africa.
Welcome to this special edition of the Mobilize podcast. Today we continue the conversation in the MoneyTalks series brought to you by Mobilize as well as the new Economy Hub. MoneyTalks is a global public opinion research project and dialogue series that explores what ordinary people really think about the issues like tax, debt, and global finance. In 2025, MoneyTalks ran surveys across 10 countries, including South Africa and Kenya, asking people how they understand national debt, what fairness looks like when governments borrow, and most significantly, who they think is responsible for ensuring that fairness. Today's conversation builds on those findings and the Jubilee Report, which was published by the Pontifical Academy in June 2025, which argues that global debt crisis is not just a financial crisis, but a moral and developmental crisis. I'm Sekoetlane Phamodi, and I'm the Program Director of the new Economy Hub, and your host for this very special episode with Professor Grieve Chelwa, who was recently named one of the top 10 African scholars to watch. He was a member of the panel appointed by Pope Francis at the time, and a member of the Jubilee Commission. He is an associate professor of political economy, specializing in African economic issues, as well as the chair of the social sciences department at the African Institute in the United Arab Emirates. Grieve, thank you so much for joining us today. We want to get the most out of this interview, which I think we should really just dive straight into.
Sekoetlane, it's such an honor to be here and great to meet you.
Amazing. Yes. So before we get into the heart of it all, can you maybe just tell us a little bit about yourself? Can you give us maybe a sense of how you grew up, where you grew up, and how it came to shape the person that you are today?
That's an interesting question, taking me down memory lane. I was born in Zambia in 1983. And I was born in Lusaka, Zambia, at one of the most famous hospitals in Zambia, precisely because this hospital is a product of like an amazing dream by our first president, Kenneth Kaunda. And it really is, I think it is a sign of self-sufficiency. It's a sign of ambition. It's like a giant hospital built by this, at the time, very tiny country with a very small population. But really, I think it encapsulates the dreams and hopes and aspirations of that generation of our first leaders. So I was born at the University Teaching Hospital, a public hospital. And then I grew up sort of like the 80s were a very interesting time for Zambia, because we were sort of transitioning from a moment of hope to a moment of despair, right? I think the first 2 decades after Zambia got independence in the 60s were really a moment of hope, a moment of ambition, drive. University Teaching Hospital was built at this time, and in the 80s were a very tough time, because that is when Africa was undergoing its first debt crisis. So in a sense, I was growing up in the 80s. I don't quite remember the 80s very much because I was sort of a young boy, but I remember the 90s very vividly. And the 90s were, lots of scholars of Africa have referred to the 90s as Africa's lost decade, because that is a decade when the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank are really in charge of setting economic policy in Africa. It's when they implement the so-called structural adjustment policies, which resulted in mass misery, negative growth, mass layoffs, privatization of water, privatization of essential utilities, privatization of health. So that is the decade that I came of age. And I think, in a sense, this mass misery really stuck with me. And I suspect that is probably what inspired me to do economics, because I can't for the life of me, why did I do economics? But I think coming of age in the 1990s in this collapsing Zambia, right, I think sort of inspired within me that I needed to do something to understand how it is a once thriving economy could end up in a situation of desperation and mass misery. So I then sort of finished high school in the late 90s, in 1999. And I think this was really the bottom of that type of misery. And then I went to university very early in the new century. So I went into university in 2003 at the University of Zambia, and certainly went immediately to study economics. But I also was very lucky because I was entering the University of Zambia when the first generation of Zambian professors were retiring. So these are the guys who were the first sort of Zambian profs, for an independent country. So they were just about to retire, and then I learned at their feet, right? And I think that was also very pivotal, because then they would tell us, let us tell you what it was like when Zambia had progressive policies and when Zambia was on a mission, right? And then let us tell you what went wrong. So I then learned at the feet of these masters, as it were. And then I studied economics, graduated. I took a very interesting detour. I went to work private sector. I went to work for a bank, believe it or not. I didn't last long. I lasted a year. They said my suits went the best. So in a sense, I laid myself off, as it were, and then I went back to school, got a PhD, and now I'm an academic. So I'm sorry, it seems like I've compressed the story, but that essentially is the story of my life up to this point.
So how does this experience then shape what you teach? You specialize in African economic issues at the African Institute. What does that then look like? What is the kind of teaching and learning, and what kind of topics do you take your students through in understanding African economic issues?
Sekoetlane, that's an excellent question. All right, so how has my experience of growing up in 1990 Zambia shaped what I teach? And that's an important point, because it's something that I don't take lightly, right? So this semester, for example, I'm teaching a course, The Political Economy of Africa, right? And in this course, I am very deliberate about the thinkers that I'm exposing to my students. One of the things that is often neglected, or at least conveniently forgotten, is that Africans have been thinking, and have always thought, from time immemorial, about our condition and how to better our condition. So we have in our pantheon, a collection of bright thinkers, bright lights. So I teach them somewhat like the professors who taught me, the ones I talked about at the University of Zambia. So these are the kind of thinkers I'm exposing my students to. Different genders, different, ideological persuasions, but all of them passionate about Africa. All of them passionate about providing a dignified analysis of the African condition, right? So we're a continent that has been at the receiving end of all sorts of theories about why we are poor, and often many of those theories can be insulting and denigrating. But what I do in this course, again, informed by my own experience, is to teach thinkers who have given a dignified analysis of the African condition, right?
Very important.
Yeah.
When you were giving us a sense of your biography, you mentioned growing up in the 90s. And I also grew up in the 90s. I came up in the 90s. And one of the things that are a real core memory for me was this campaign called the Jubilee campaign. You were a member of the Jubilee Commission appointed by Pope Francis, focusing on economic issues and economic resilience for a new age and a new era for humanity. And I just wanted to maybe kind of connect those dots a little bit. And maybe I could start by asking you, what is a papal jubilee? What's that about? Where did it come from?
That's Sekoetlane. That's another excellent question. So what is this idea of a jubilee? So I'm not Roman Catholic, but having spent time with Catholics, especially in our work on this commission, I was educated about it. So every 25 years, I think in the Catholic doctrine and the Catholic tradition, is a year of the Jubilee. And this is a year when debts are supposed to be forgiven. So I think that is where this notion of the Jubilee comes from. And you did mention the growing up in the 90s. Just like me, I vividly remember some of my heroes and heroines are people who I used to see on TV campaigning to have Africa's debt, unjust debt cancelled. in that first Jubilee moment. So yes, so in the year 2000 was another Jubilee moment. And at the time, Pope John Paul II basically, I think, saw the total injustice that debt was wreaking on countries in the global south, particularly in Africa, which is something that has also been happening now, whereby these countries are forced to sacrifice investments in their people, health, education, agriculture, and so on and so forth, to satisfy the requirements of creditors. So I think there was a wonderful moment at the time. He put together a commission, much like the one that Pope Francis put together. There was mobilization by social movements. I think the social movements were really at the core, at the forefront, women, young people, really pushing. And this was successful, in that it led to the cancellation of much of Africa's debt, via the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative and so on and so forth. In this moment that we're in, we are back to square one. We're back again, unfortunately, to where we were in 2000. So Pope Francis put together this commission. Unfortunately, he didn't live to see the report being published because he left us. But yeah, that's essentially what the Catholic doctrine of the Jubilee means. It happens every 25 years, and it's meant to cancel debts, because debts are seen as unjust, debts are seen as immoral, and debts are seen as, we have a morality where we like to think of debts as things you did to yourself. But I think this Catholic doctrine understands debt as structural, as something that happens outside of the individual. So it's kind of moment of renewal.
So let's talk a little bit about this highly indebted poor countries initiative that emerged following the campaigns towards the Papal Jubilee 25 years ago. What did that really entail? What did it mean, and who did it benefit?
So basically, the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, again, very much influenced by the wonderful work that people in the Jubilee 2000 campaign did, this mobilizing, this campaigning, this pushing, this arguing. Essentially, they came to a point where there was a recognition that many of these debts were unjust, right? Many of these debts that African countries were experiencing were unjust. I'll give you an example of Zambia. So at the time, Zambia's debts were somewhere around about $7 billion. And one of the major reasons why Zambia had accumulated that amount of debt was that when we got independence in 1964, we had a very big mining sector, copper mining industry. But that copper mining industry was in the hands of private multinationals, Anglo-American Corporation and American Metal Climates. So
South African companies,
yes. So our first president obviously then said to himself, what is the point of gaining independence when you have no control over your natural resources? So he then decided to nationalize that particular industry. Now we have to be very careful we have to be very careful in distinguishing how he did it versus how it was done in Chile under Salvador Allende, for example, and potentially influenced and by what happened to Salvador Allende after nationalization, right? So the Americans took him out. So our president was probably careful and said, I can't go the Chile way. So what I'll do is I'll buy out Anglo-American Corporation and American Metal Climax. But we didn't have the money to do it. So what did we do? We took out debt, which is a very tragic story. We took out debt to buy our dignity, right? So this is the genesis of Zambia's debt that was forgiven by the HIPIC initiative. So the HIPIC initiative, essentially, folks made these kinds of arguments about injustice and so on and so forth. And then the HIPIC initiative essentially resulted in debts being cancelled. Right.
So what did these highly indebted poor countries then have to give back in exchange, or give up in exchange, in order to benefit from this HIPIC initiative?
That's a very excellent question. So was it free? Was it a free lunch is your question. I mean, there were some conditions that were attached to it, but not as drastic or not as crushing as the ones that came in the 1990s with structural adjustment. And part of this I ascribe or I attribute to, again, the success of the Jubilee 2000 campaign. I think we haven't appreciated just how successful that campaign was. So that campaign, in a sense, was so successful that some of the conditions were very minimal. For example, I mean, some of them were actually pro-social, like increase primary school enrollment, et cetera, et cetera. So the conditions were were not as drastic as the ones from the 1990s, because I think the moral argument, the case had been made, right? So, like in Zambia's case, they were very minimal, increase primary school enrollment, entrenched democracy and so on and so forth. And then this resulted in Zambia's debt being cancelled in just 1 year. In just 1 year, it moved from $7 billion to about $1 billion overnight, right? And this happened right across many countries in the global south.
Yeah, that's really an incredible impact for ordinary people who want their governments to invest in them rather than servicing debts that they don't see the benefits of.
Yeah, very right, Seko. And, one of the most interesting things about this particular moment was that by the way, another point that is worth mentioning is that the success of the Jubilee 2000 campaign was even at the level of semantics, because the global north were using the word relief. We're going to give you debt relief. And the people in the global south who are campaigning were saying, no, this is not a gift. This is something we are owed, because the debts are unjust, as the Zambian case suggests. Zambia had to buy its own dignity by borrowing. So this is an unjust debt. So the actual word is cancellation, not forgiveness or relief, but cancellation, right? So again, it's a remarkable success of that campaign. But the important point, Sako, is that when these debts were cancelled, and by the way, it's interesting, again, coming back to my own biography, I graduated in 2006 from the University of Zambia. So this is 2 years after HIPIC, after the debts were forgiven. And you could see the benefits right across. You could see the Zambian government immediately began to invest in their people. Education, health, agriculture, the economy became very vibrant. When I graduated, youth unemployment was at a historic low. People like me from my graduating class had many job opportunities, right? Really illustrating just how much of a yoke debt can be.
Yes.
Right? So it is not the case again that, and you hear this a lot by especially folks from the north when they're trying to theorize about the African state, and they said, they probably wasted away the savings from debt cancellation. But no, they actually invested in their own people. We invested in our peasant farmers in Zambia. We invested in food. For example, Zambia became food sufficient in this period, precisely because we used those savings to invest in our people and so on and so forth.
So you've really taken us through or helped us to humanize this very technical issue, or at least this issue that is made to look and feel technical and distant from ordinary people. Now, in the MoneyTalks report this year, the data showed that only 16% of people felt that they understood national debt, and yet, like you described already, it shapes such fundamental aspects of day-to-day life and dignity. It shapes whether and how hospitals, schools, and even the possibility of dignified work opportunities and livelihoods are possible at all or not, what the quality of services might be. So I'd like to maybe ask you, how do we help ourselves move away from this overly technocratic language and really try to kind of have or bring up greater focus to the human implications that assist people in understanding these stories around, why countries are so highly indebted and what the implications might be and the choices that governments have to make?
Sekoetlane, I mean, that's also a good question. Why this drive to make conversations about debt, which at the end of the day are conversations about people, technocratic and alienating. But that is a ploy. It's a neoliberal ploy, right? To try to say, you ordinary people don't understand this. This is beyond you. This is complex macroeconomics. Experts, technocrats are the ones who should resolve this. Just stand by the wayside whilst we do our job. But at the end of the day, it's, like you say, it's political. Debt is political. Debt is about bread and butter issues. Debt is about the future of our children. It's about the future of our economies. So it has to be debate. The debate has to be democratic. All right. And I think platforms like this, you and I discussing, is essentially we need to have much more of this. We need to demystify debt. We need to explain to our people. By the way, our people are very. I mean, I've spent a great deal of time in movements, talking to the masses of our people. They're incredibly sharp. They can smell a rat. They can smell a rat. They'll ask the questions. If we have so much gold, if we have so much cocoa, if we have so much copper, why is it that we are borrowing? Why are we indebted? So they understand it, right? And I think this technocratic move, by the way, which has happened over the last 30 years with the ascendancy of neoliberalism, has been strategic to try to alienate our people. So I agree that this should not, it is not a technocratic discussion. This is a political discussion, and it should be a democratic discussion where every one of us is engaged equally. Right.
So let's maybe unroll some of the technical smoke and mirrors that are thrown our way. Understanding that our people can smell the rat. In fact, they can point out exactly where it is. Can you maybe just tell us a little bit about how the debt system operates? Who are some of the key players in the debt system? Where's the borrowing coming from? Are governments, and particularly governments of highly indebted countries, borrowing from other governments? Are they borrowing from the private sector? Who sets the terms? How does it work?
I mean, so how does debt come about, right? How much time do we have? but I think so. At the core, I'm going to say, debt is for the folks who want to keep Africa subservient, debt is the most effective and efficient tool of control, right? So from their point of view, if Africa is indebted, we can control it, right? And this is not an idea that's original to me. Thomas Sankara, the great Burkinabe revolutionary, said it in 1987 in a speech at the Organization of African Unity in Addis. He was very clear when he theorized the role of debt in subjugating Africa, right? But we need to now understand, okay, so if African governments know that debt is going to lead in a situation of control, why do they borrow in the first place? I think it is for primarily, they see it as for a primarily sensible reason. So one of the things that you need to do to develop is to invest in your people, right? To make huge investment outlays for you to develop. You need roads, you need schools. Sekoetlane, you and I are a product of schools. Exactly. This is why we're here, right? You need hospital or products of hospitals. You need power stations. You need huge amounts of infrastructure outlays to be able to develop. Now, for a while, after the Modo independence decade of the 1960s, for a while, many African countries did catch up because the colonialists built economies that only served their interests, that served extraction. So what you would have seen and what you see up to now in many African countries is you see a rail line that heads to the port.
Exactly,
right?
Yeah.
Because it's taking the natural resources out, right? So many African countries, when they got independence, they saw this and they realized we've got to fix this by building infrastructure that aids development that is inclusive and so on and so forth. So for a while, we were successful in this regard. And then the crisis of the 80s that we spoke about earlier arrived. And then the structural adjustment policies of the 90s. And basically, the IMF and World Bank, knowing that, okay, we need to create conditions for these countries to subsequently borrow, they essentially, one of their key policy levers in the 1990s was to say, do not spend on infrastructure as a government. The private sector will provide it. A very bizarre and useless type of argument. In fact, the tragedy of the African university today, if you go to many African universities, the universities are in crisis. That is a result of World Bank prescription that basically said, you don't need to provide public university education. If there is a demand, this is their sophistry, the private sector will provide it, right? Anyways. So basically, for 2 decades, from 1990s to the 2000s, many African countries stopped investing in infrastructure. So when the 2010s arrived, all of a sudden it became very clear that you haven't been investing, right? And the signs were there, were everywhere. Rolling blackouts or load shedding, traffic jams, lack of water shortages, not enough places in the schools for our children, and so on and so forth. So then African governments became very impatient to try to catch up, right? So what happened? They went and borrowed, unfortunately. Now, and the IMF and World Bank were very happy for them to go out and borrow. I mean, if you read some of the reports from the 2000s, you see them actually saying, you've got to borrow. In fact, a countrymate of mine, who is ideologically on a very different plane to me, Dambi Samoyo, wrote a book called Dead Aid.
Yes.
And in that book, she had a chapter called A Capital Solution, where she argued African countries just go and borrow. The World Bank and IMF embraced her and loved it, right? So, and then we went out and borrowed, and then we, borrowed from the wrong people. We borrowed from private, from hedge funds, from Western banks, and even some from China, right? So essentially, this is the source. This is the genesis to why we borrowed. I think it's important for the audience to understand it is not from a lack of imagination or a lack of sophistication on the part of our governments. I think there was a real need to plug the infrastructure deficit, particularly also in an environment where we have multinationals that don't even pay taxes. So we have an environment where governments have got a very difficult time to mobilize domestic resources, right? So what did they do? They went and borrowed. Unfortunately, they listened to the IMF and World Bank, which is a thing I fought them. They always do this, right? So, and then we ended up in this current moment, Sekoetlane. And I'm sorry I took a very long, winded way to get here. But then we ended up in this moment where we're yet again, indebted.
So let's go a little bit deeper into the debt stack. The Jubilee Report, which you were a part of writing, notes and has extensive citations and sources to back this up, that African countries, almost by design, tend to pay more in debt servicing costs than what they do or what they ought to be paying relative to other countries, usually in the what we used to call the global north, tend to countries like Italy, which have very, very high debt to GDP ratios, even higher than our own, but somehow get a better deal on debt than African countries do. Could you maybe just tell us a little bit about how the cost of debt is priced? Right? Who gets to determine that, and whether it's a fair system?
Sekoetlane, the short answer is no. It is not a fair system. That is capitalism. Capitalism has never worked for the downtrodden, for the marginalized, for the forgotten, which is essentially those of us in the global south, and in particular those of us from Africa. So you're very right. What we tend to see is the technical term for it is that Africa has a higher risk premium that is not justified on the basis of the history of default. So to put it differently, African countries are actually very good participants of financial markets, right? They pay. More often than not, they pay the interest payments. Sometimes they default, but more often than not, they pay their interest payments. And what you tend to find is that we should have the cost of borrowing, the interest rate should be lower than what they actually are, and should be lower than some of the countries that you mentioned in the global north, which are consistent defaulters and so on and so forth. But that's essentially how capitalism works. Capitalism, especially global capitalism, works on the basis that there's a mass of impoverished people who form the underbelly, and those folks can then be exploited, and extraction happens to the benefit of the very few, which is in the global north. That's just how global capitalism works. So and then global capitalism, to justify all this craziness, devises institutions to do it, right? And one of the institutions that is responsible for this unjustified high risk premium are the credit rating agencies.
So this is the Standards and Poor's.
Standards and Poor's, Fitch, Moody's, for some very bizarre reason, but it is not bizarre because this is how global capitalism works. We have private entities, not even public entities. They're essentially private entities, and their word is supposed to be the gospel truth. So these entities are the ones who then say the South African government, the Zambian government, the Angolan government, the Nigerian government, their risk of default, according to our analysis, is this much. Therefore, this should be the interest rate.
Now,
right?
do we know anything about the methodologies that these ratings agencies use? Because, I mean, as a person who has an adult debt
Yeah.
or two in my name, I know that I have to fill out forms, I have to go visit the bank manager, and we have a discussion about, like, what my risk profile looks like. Am I young? Am I educated? Am I stable? Am I married? And those sorts of things. And then sometimes they send people over to, the asset that I want to borrow money for, to assess it and also assess, like, how I live. Does it work the same with these credit rating agencies?
I mean, there's a performance of such, sophistication, right? So they will say we have criteria that is objective, but more often than not, scholars who have looked at it very closely find out that there's a lot of bias introduced into these assessments. But we have to know that this bias is not accidental, it is by design, right? It is by design precisely because they've got to extract from the poorer parts of the world, right? So this is by design. So often, actually, the methodologies are not as transparent as they ought to be. In other words, if you and I did the same exercise of trying to rate the credit worthiness of the Zambian state, we would arrive at a totally different conclusion to the ones that these ratings agencies arrive at. So it's actually biased. It's incredibly biased. But this is how capitalism works. For example, it's not just a global south phenomenon. Even in the global north, you tend to find, there's now a lot of evidence about the financial crisis of 2008, which was started by the mortgage crisis in the housing market. I mean, there's like now lots of information on record. Racist evaluations of borrowers. Basically, black people in the US were unfairly judged as more risky, therefore loaded with very expensive debt. And then they were obviously going to default. Right, but that's the point. The point is, even US capitalism at a domestic level requires an underbelly. Right, for you to survive. So,
and this pattern was also registered here in South Africa, where a complaint was made about one of our big banks also using these very racist risk analysis measures, which effectively meant that black people were paying more for debt and being offered less than white or perhaps what were the Indian professional classes, given our history of the tricameral parliament, and Africans being set up as the third-class citizens, the underbelly that you describe of our country. Now, I maybe want to kind of shift into this conversation around blame. MoneyTalks found that about 70% of citizens in both South Africa as well as in Kenya tend to blame domestic mismanagement for the levels of debt that we are carrying and their impact on development than on global rules. Is this something, or is this narrative a credible narrative? It sounds like you don't agree with that, but could you maybe kind of give us, or maybe give us some brief analysis around, how do we need to understand the relationship between bad fiscal governance, which is something that we see often, from these global rules which are rigged against us?
I mean, by the way, Sekoetlane, that's an excellent question. And I'm not surprised that the majority of our people in South Africa and Kenya are blaming sort of domestic issues as the fundamental causes of the debt crisis. Again, this is the success of neoliberalism, right? One of the things that has risen is sort of as a narrative of the last 30 years has been the corruption in industry, corruption industrial complex. Right, we have the corruption perceptions index that you may be familiar with, that comes from Transparency International, which bizarrely always scores African countries as the most corrupt, even when there are massive scandals in the US, in Europe, or wherever. I mean, even when these, these papers, like something like Panama Papers, these papers that are leaked that show us just the scale of Western corruption, that never moves the needle in terms of corruption's perception index. So a great many of our young people, a great many of our people who have grown up over the last 30 years have been fed this garbage. Right? That the primary cause, and you see it all the time, corruption is the boogeyman, right? The primary cause of your condition, Africans, is corruption. We are taught that in class, we're taught that in school. Books have been written about it. You see them in the airport bookstores. The problem is domestic. Now, this is not to say there's not a domestic problem. There's a domestic problem. Corruption is not a uniquely African thing. Actually, the original sin of corruption was slavery.
Exactly.
Was the transatlantic slavery, colonialism, imperialism, neo-colonialism, right? And by the way, an excellent report was published in 2015, and the whole process of writing that report was headed by Thabo Mbeki, who's your ex-president. It's called the Mbeki Panel on Illicit Financial Flows.
Yes.
Basically, this panel wanted to figure out where are Africa's resources being spirited away. And this report found out that, and at the time they did say that we suspect this is an underestimate, $50 billion per annum, every year, disappears from Africa through what they call illicit financial flows. And the biggest culprit, and they did do a quantification, 70% of that is due to the multinational corporations, the companies we love to glorify, the ones that have the most sexiest, social media presences. This company, wow, they've got maybe butterflies and flowers in their ads. Those are the culprits, right? And corruption, as our citizens understand it, played a very minor particular role there. So again, it's just to say narratives matter. And our friends on the neoliberal side have been very, very successful, very, very successful in drumming down our people's throats that the problem is you, just like how racism works and racism justification, right?
So you're too sensitive.
Sorry?
You're too sensitive.
Yeah, too sensitive, and it is you. Work on yourself. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right, is the kind of situation. So that's precisely what it is. But to answer your question more substantively, careful scholars who've looked at the reasons why Africa finds itself in this permanent state of crisis, right? Careful scholars who've done a dignified analysis of it have often found out that it is external forces. Be there commodity markets, be there actual nefarious things like coup d'etats or assassinations. I mean, obviously, history is replete with these kinds of stories. So I think it is incumbent upon people like you and me, Seko, to do the work of trying to raise the consciousness of our people and telling a proper history of Africa. Yeah.
No, absolutely. Now, we are 25 years after or since the last Jubilee campaign, and the in principle agreement that this is something that needed to happen, but it was a matter of dotting I's, crossing T's, and establishing the systems by which the HIPIC 1 initiative, as we call it today, could offer the kind of relief that was required. Building greater investment in the people, which is really the true wealth of a nation, in providing the social expenditure that we need and deserve in order to be able to assure us secure lives and dignity. But things have shifted quite fundamentally since 2000. We're facing a very different set of circumstances in this conjuncture. We have a cost of living crisis that is not only affecting us who are in the majority world and even in highly indebted countries, but is also causing major instability in the rich countries of the world. The USA, the UK, France is now unable to hold a government together and is in serious political crisis. We're seeing the same in Germany as well, the cyclical crisis of democracy. At the same time, there are these big contentions around whether we should be investing as much as we are being called to or even saying we need to in things like climate justice, building renewable energy infrastructure, building climate adaptation infrastructure, but also the adaptation of our economies to no longer be so reliant on fossil fuels. You said earlier that for an economy to grow in its time and place and its context, a massive amount of investment is required. African countries and other majority world countries, the poorer countries of the world, are being offered more debt by the majority world countries the minority world countries counter to the Paris Agreement, which says that actually what's required is public finance and not more debt finance as such. Could you maybe just talk us through this interplay between the need to invest in climate responsive infrastructure for our futures vis-a-vis, the sovereign debt challenge that we, or trap that we find ourselves locked into and being offered more debt to go deeper into. Should we be buying the skeleton?
No, it is a skeleton. No, you're right. We shouldn't be, right? And when we talked earlier, Sekoetlane, about what is the fundamental driver of Africa's debt problem and Africa's permanent crisis, and we talked about external factors and external forces, climate is one of those, right? Many countries in Africa have had to borrow because of climate shocks. Right. Again, my own country, Zambia, is a classic example here. Zambia relies on hydroelectricity for power generation. So in 2015, we had the drought, right? And this drought was induced by climate change, right? And then because of that drought, we ended up with power outages. And then the Zambian government had no choice but to import emergency power. But because they had not budgeted for it, they then borrowed at, again, very high interest rates, right, to try to provide power to their people. And also in food. So we also had a shortage of food. So again, we had to import emergency food. We had to borrow to be able to import this emergency food. And the tragedy of it is that Zambia's debt stock increased precisely because of this climate-induced event. And the tragedy is that the climate is changing not because of things we've done, but it is because of the historic emissions of folks in the global north. They're the biggest culprits when it comes to the causes of climate change. So yet again, Africa's sovereign debt crisis is related to things that we had nothing to do with, right, in terms of climate change. So you're very right. I mean, one cannot separate the issues of sovereign debt, or at least debt justice, from climate justice. They're very much linked in the way that I've just illustrated. And that's why I am with all those people who are calling for climate reparatory justice, or at least, climate justice requires that we do just by the environment, and we do just to those who are going to come after us, but also it requires that the global majority, and I love that phrase that you've been using, are owed reparations, precisely because now the vivid case of debt resulting out of climate change just shows us how grave the situation is. We are owed reparations for many things, but I think it's also climate justice requires that we be given reparatory justice, precisely because historic emitters, the culprits in the global north, who have emitted over the centuries, have created a situation where our people now are very vulnerable, and their vulnerability is then forcing them to go and borrow.
So we've spoken a great deal about the problem analysis and the history of the problem. It's very important for us because it enables us to have a really deep and clear understanding of how did we get here. But we can't go back in time to try and solve the problem. We actually have to move forward. And maybe this is really where I want to maybe pivot our conversation, into a new rule book for a new era where we have a new economy. A couple of suggestions have emerged, both in the Jubilee Report, but also through the various advocacy campaigns, think tanks, African think tanks at that, like ASSET, like Afrodad, like IEJ for that matter, and many others around what might be required. The first proposal that I maybe want us to maybe talk to is this idea of a global debt registry or a borrower's charter. Could you maybe just explain for us crisply what is meant by that and what it would change?
I think so. One of the things about how sort of sovereign debt works is we often have no idea who the ultimate creditors are, right? So we often speak in a very nebulous way about, the creditors are, we know they're mostly in the global north, the ones who are supplying the credit, but we have no idea about who they are. Right, we have just no idea about how much debt is out there, who is owed, at what interest rate. So I think this notion of a debt register is just precisely that. We just need to be able to track and figure out who do we owe, right? At what interest rate? Where are the beneficial owners? Just this kind of like transparency and this kind of sort of accountability. So at the precise core, that is what a debt register is.
So the public transparency for public debt should go beyond what the nation itself reports to be borrowing, but also about, compiling that globally as well as getting to grips with who the mashonisas are.
Exactly. That's true. The mashonisa, exactly, who in Zambia would call them I've forgotten the phrase, but I wish I could remember it, but it's exactly, it's somewhat just related to mashonisa. It has to, because one of the things that, Seko, just think about it. In the present moment, if we had to have a conversation about debt, we know who the highly indebted are. They're paraded on CNN, BBC, or it is Zambia, Kenya, Ghana, but we have no idea who the creditors are. We have a suspicion, but we don't really know who the beneficial owners are, right? And I think this, and I like your thinking about it, transparency is two ways, right? At the domestic level, which we know a great deal, but we don't know who the creditors are. And this debt register would allow, it's also a nice way to name and shame, right? So who are the voucher funds that are exploiting and extracting these countries? So I think that's the idea of essentially a debt register.
So let's maybe go into the second proposal that has been pushed very hard, which is this idea of a borrower's club. Could you maybe explain that a little bit? What is a borrower's club? Why do we need one? And how does that link up to this question of transparency?
So I think this idea of a borrower's club was buried in a speech that Thomas Sankara made to the last speech, by the way, that he made at the OAU before he was murdered, before he was taken from us. And basically in his speech, he just said, folks, brothers and sisters, we need an African united front against debt. He said, if I today say I'm not going to pay then just debt, I won't be here next year. Quite prescient. But if we all say we won't pay, they will have no choice but to meet us halfway, right? They'll have no choice but to meet us halfway. And I think this is the idea of a borrower's club. So the creditors on the other side are very organized. So you've heard about the Paris Club, right? But the borrowers, we are not organized. When Zambia wants to restructure its debt, it does it alone, right? In a room full of powerful creditors, Zambia is bound to lose, right? So it's this idea, you might have heard about it. If you owe the bank $10,000, it is your problem. If you owe the bank $100 million, it's the bank's problem. So that's the notion of a borrower's club. Right now, African external debt is about $1 trillion collectively, right? If $1 trillion was at stake and we all got together as African brothers and sisters, they would have no choice if we said to them, if you do not reduce the interest payment, to reflect the true cost of default, we're not going to pay. They would have no choice but to listen to us. So this is the idea behind the Borrowers Club. The idea is that we've got to get together and put forward a united front against debt.
But now, what's keeping us from doing that? What's causing countries like Zambia, Malawi, Kenya even, to not share data transparently and coordinate between themselves? Is it because they think that they have the power and capability to go it alone, or is there something more structural at play?
I mean, that's the $1 trillion question which we've been trying to get an answer to ever since, our great ancestor Kwame Nkrumah told us in 1963 to unite. He said, unite or perish, right? And it's not just unite in terms of debt, but we need to unite on all fronts, at the level of the economy, at the level of the military, and all those kinds of things. We can't keep on hanging on to these colonial creations, which are these countries, right? So yeah, why are we not able to coordinate at the level of debt restructuring? It's a question that has also bothered me, because the advantages seem very clear, right? But again, it is the way global capitalism works. Divide and rule, right? It is divide and rule. It's a structural thing that is built into it. So it is very difficult in this kind of system to be able to, and you see it at different levels. Why can't workers unite? I mean, that's the point. Workers unite and tell their employers that we're not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to work on Maggie's farm no more, whatever, But so it is just the way capitalism works, and it thrives on divide and conquer. So that has been the problem here.
So we're recording this conversation just a few days before the G20 Leaders Summit is convened here in South Africa. All through the year, there have been these debates and dialogues between particularly the finance ministers and central bank governors in what's called the finance track of the G20, a very closed, exclusive track in this government-to-government process. And one of the mechanisms that they had previously agreed on at the beginning of, or early on after the financial crisis that gave occasion to the G20 being established in the first place, was this thing called the G20 Common Framework on Debt Treatments. There's been a lot of campaigning from civil society, think tanks, the faith community, especially from the Catholic community, around this issue of the need for a total reform or even restructuring of the G20 Common Framework towards something working title, a Global Debt Justice Compact. Could you maybe just tell us a little bit about the G20 Common Framework, and how the rule book needs to be changed to govern a fair deal on debt, especially for African and majority world countries and their economies?
That's an excellent question, Sekoetlane, and you're right. The common framework came out of the G20 process. So one of the most glaring aspects of the international financial architecture as it currently works is we don't have an organized way of dealing with sovereign debt defaults at the international level, right? At the domestic level, we have bankruptcy laws, and we know how to deal with individuals or companies that file for bankruptcy. But a default is a country filing for bankruptcy, and we have no organized way at the global level of dealing with it. So one proposal that came out of the G20 was a common framework. In my opinion, a terrible idea, because essentially so the idea itself, the principle behind it was to say, can we find a platform for a country to bring its creditors together and to negotiate with them, right? And then we shall have a common framework by which this is done. So for Zambia, one option would be that Zambia negotiates directly with all its creditors, right? But the thinking was that this may be inefficient, right? So, and the negotiations may be contradictory, all these kinds of stuff. So why don't we bring everybody under one umbrella, under one platform, the common framework, and then Zambia can negotiate in one fell swoop, in one go with all its creditors. But again, that doesn't resolve the issue of contradicting interests and divergent interests and geopolitical interests, right? So the common framework has certainly not worked. I'll give you an example. Zambia applied for common framework treatment in April of 2021. Up until today, Zambia's debt has not been satisfactorily addressed.
Sure.
5 years almost on accounting of complete, complete uncertainty, complete paralysis, and in the process, the lives of 20 million Zambians are at stake and getting worse.
And so ultimately, there's a real human cost for delay.
It's a real human cost for delay, right? So I think what we need is an international financial system that, if it is truly about justice and a country files for bankruptcy, a country enters default, immediately funds are released that move towards that country as it is trying to resolve its crisis. But what happens now is immediately a country files for bankruptcy, default, funds actually fly out, and that country is immediately shut out of the international financial system, right? So in a sense, it's what we are saying in the report, that with regards to Africa, funds are counter-cyclical and not pro-cyclical, right? When there's a crisis, funds leave as opposed to reverse. So in any case, what we need a system to resolve sovereign debt crisis that is anchored on justice, right? That is insulated from geopolitical shenanigans, as the common framework has been sort of, it has really found itself caught up between China, the West, the private creditors, to the detriment of very small countries. So essentially, I think this is the key thing. We've got to get to a point where we have a sovereign debt resolution infrastructure that is anchored on justice.
Right. So really on that note, I think that this is a great place to close, because that is the essence of the call from the Jubilee Report, from global civil society, from African countries and governments. And of course, this is the advocacy that the South African G20 presidency is leading in this year of the G20. I don't know whether we will get any real outcome for this in the time to come, but certainly, and also just kind of referencing back to some of the things that you really reminded us that we need to do, is that we do need to keep putting the pressure up and getting ourselves the justice that we not only need, but which we deserve, so that we don't keep having to buy and bail ourselves out for our dignity. So with that, Grieve, really thank you so much for taking this time out with us. I can't thank you enough for bringing such clarity, such detail, and such simplicity and care to this conversation. I really hope that we can have this kind of a conversation again, but perhaps on a better note where we've seen some improvements happening. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Sekoetlane, it was an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Amazing. So thank you everyone for dialing into this conversation that we've had. The special series of the Mobilize podcast focuses on MoneyTalks, the research project that has been helping us to clarify, demystify, and really understand what people think about the major finance issues that affect our lives every day. Tax, climate and climate investment, and most significantly, especially for this year of the Jubilee, debt and debt justice. We hope that you will continue to join the Mobilize podcast and really engage in some of the issues and debates that matter most to us for today as well as for our future. My name is Sekoetlane Phamodi, and this was Mobilize podcast. Thank you.